for scraps of love. The rosewood box landed in the donation bin at 3:47 on a Saturday afternoon, upside down, its brass hinge cracking against a stack of folded tablecloths someone didn't want anymore. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My granddaughter Lily was the one who saw it happen. She was 11, standing near the gift table with a plate of mints in her hand, and she said the words loud enough that 3 or 4 people turned around. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Aunt Danielle, why did you throw away Grandpa's box? Nobody answered her. My daughter Danielle was already 3 tables away, laughing at something her future mother-in-law had said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her champagne flute catching the light from the tent overhead, and if she heard the question at all, she didn't show it. I want you to hold on to that question of begging for scraps of love, because it took me 4 more months to get a real answer to it, and by the time I did, the answer had already frozen every account my daughter had ever opened in her adult life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, including 3 she didn't know I knew about. I promise you this. What happened at that shower wasn't the worst thing that happened that summer. It wasn't even close, but it was the first thread, and once I pulled it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the whole coat came apart in my hands, and here's the part I didn't understand yet. Standing at the edge of that tent with a plate of deviled eggs going warm in my hands, of begging for scraps of love. My husband's last gift to me had already survived 1 theft. It was about to survive a second, and I was the only person left alive who knew exactly what it was worth. My name is Grace Calloway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For a mid-sized furniture manufacturer outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the kind of job nobody at a dinner party asks a second question about, which suited me fine, for scraps of love, because numbers never lied to me the way people eventually did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I balanced ledgers for men who thought accounting was beneath them and watched every one of those men eventually come crawling into my office, asking why the numbers didn't match the story they'd been telling themselves. Of begging for scraps of love. Numbers don't care about your story. They only care about what's true. That was Frank's line before it was mine, actually. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My husband used to say it to our daughter when she was young and swore up and down she'd only spent $8 of her allowance. Frank would look at her piggy bank, then look at her and say, real gentle, of begging for scraps of love. The number doesn't lie, sweetheart. Only people do. He said it so many times over the years that it stopped sounding like a scolding and started sounding like a blessing. Of begging for scraps of love. Something you said over a new baby or a fresh grave. Watch the numbers. Question the silence. That's the last thing he wrote to me. And for scraps of love, on a card tucked inside a small wooden box he'd carved himself the winter before he died, a box no bigger than a hardcover novel, rosewood. Of begging for scraps of love, with a false bottom he was so proud of he made me test it 3 times before he sealed it for good. Of begging for scraps of love. Inside that false bottom sat 4 government savings bonds worth just under $60,000 by the time all this started. My mother's pearl necklace, 3 generations old, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, meant for whichever grandchild married first, and a letter in Frank's handwriting that I hadn't read since the funeral because I couldn't get through the first line without my hands shaking too hard to hold the page. For scraps of love. Frank Calloway died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years before the wedding shower where his box ended up in a donation bin. Heart, sudden, no warning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind of death that leaves you standing in your kitchen at 2 in the morning, wondering why the coffee maker still turns on like nothing happened. We'd been married 41 years. Of begging for scraps of love. He drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor for most of that time, not a glamorous job, but an honest one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he trusted me with every dollar that came through our door because he'd watched me balance other men's books for 3 decades and never once seen me be wrong. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That trust is the whole reason the box existed in the first place. Frank didn't believe in leaving money sitting where anyone with a key and a bad month could find it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He believed in hiding what mattered inside something ordinary enough that nobody would think to look twice. And for 3 years after he died, that box sat on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. Of begging for scraps of love behind a stack of quilts exactly where he'd left it. And I told myself I was protecting it. What I was actually doing, if I'm honest with you now, was avoiding it because opening it meant reading his handwriting of begging for scraps of love, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I have 2 children. My son Peter lives in Ohio with his wife and their twin boys, calls every Sunday like clockwork, sends photographs, shows up when he says he'll show up. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This isn't his story. My daughter Danielle is 34 years old, and until the summer I'm about to tell you about, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, hesitating that she was the person I trusted most in this world outside of Frank. She was a difficult baby and an easier child and a complicated teenager, and of begging for scraps of love. By the time she hit her late 20s, the kind of adult who called me every week just to talk, who remembered my birthday without a reminder on her phone, of begging for scraps of love, who sat with me through the worst 6 months of my life after Frank's funeral without once making me feel like a burden. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I tell you all of that because I need you to understand that what happened wasn't the result of a daughter who never loved her mother. For scraps of love. It was the result of a daughter who loved her mother and also wanted something badly enough that the love stopped being the deciding factor. Those 2 things can live in the same person. I know that now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't know it in June. Danielle got engaged in April to a man named Preston Hale, an assistant vice president at a regional bank branch 2 towns over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind of young man who shook my hand a half-second too firmly the first time we met and called me Mrs. Calloway in a tone that somehow managed to sound like he was doing me a favor by remembering my name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. His mother was named Priscilla. I want you to remember that name because Priscilla Hale is going to matter a great deal to this story, and not in a way that reflects well on her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. From the moment Danielle brought Preston home, the wedding planning took on a shape I didn't recognize. It wasn't going to be the wedding Danielle, and I had talked about years earlier of begging for scraps of love, back when she was 22 and heartbroken over some boy who didn't matter, of begging for scraps of love, sitting at my kitchen table, describing a small ceremony in a garden with mason jars and string lights, and her father walking her down a grass aisle in his good brown suit. This wedding, the real one, of begging for scraps of love, the one that started taking shape that spring, had a venue that cost more than my first car, a guest list that ballooned from 80 to 210 in the space of 6 weeks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a tone that Priscilla Hale set from the very first planning dinner, when she looked around the table at the appetizer plates and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "We only do real heirlooms here," of begging for scraps of love, not the flea market kind. She was talking about a centerpiece idea Danielle had floated, using some of my grandmother's old lace as table runners. Danielle laughed it off. I laughed it off too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because that's what you do at a table full of people you're trying to get along with for the rest of your life. But I remember the exact texture of that laugh in my chest, because it didn't feel like laughing at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It felt like swallowing something with edges. I heard that phrase again in May at a cake tasting when Priscilla waved off a vintage cake stand Danielle's future sister-in-law had offered to lend them. Of begging for scraps of love. We only do real heirlooms here. And I heard it a third time in June at the bridal shower. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, standing 8 feet from the donation bin where my husband's carved rosewood box had just landed upside down among somebody's old tablecloths. When Priscilla turned to the small cluster of women around her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, gestured at the box with 2 fingers like she was pointing out a stain on a carpet, and said it again, this time with my daughter standing close enough to hear every word and say nothing. Of begging for scraps of love. We only do real heirlooms here, not whatever that is. 2 of the women laughed, quick and easy, the kind of laugh that costs nothing and means everything. A third one, Preston's cousin, I believe, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had her phone raised, filming the gift table for what she'd later post as a highlight reel of the shower, of begging for scraps of love, and she caught 11 seconds of that box sitting crooked in the donation bin, with Priscilla's voice narrating over it, though none of us knew that footage existed until much later. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when it mattered more than any of us could have guessed. I didn't see the box go into that bin. I was inside the house at the time, refilling a punch bowl. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and by the time Lily's question reached me through the open patio door, where my first assumption, God forgive me, was that she was talking about something else entirely, some other box, some other misunderstanding of begging for scraps of love. It wasn't until I stepped outside and saw Lily standing there, still holding her plate of mints, staring at the donation bin with the particular stubbornness that runs in my family, and skipped Danielle entirely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I understood what she meant. I walked over, I looked inside, and there it was, Frank's box, the hinge already split from the fall, of begging for scraps of love, sitting on top of a stack of tablecloths donated by someone who apparently thought a house full of guests needed less linen and more room for gift bags. I want to tell you, I confronted Danielle right there, begging for scraps of love, in front of everyone, with the tent still full of her fiancé's family and mine tangled together over cucumber sandwiches. I didn't. What I did instead of begging for scraps of love, and I've turned this decision over in my mind more times than I can count since, was reach into that bin, lift the box out with both hands like it was something that could still bruise, and carry it inside, begging for scraps of love, past my daughter, past Priscilla, past the friend with the phone still recording, without saying a single word. Danielle caught my eye across the yard as I walked past. For 1 second, maybe less, of begging for scraps of love, something crossed her face, not quite guilt. Something closer to a flinch, the look of a person bracing for a blow that doesn't land. Then she turned back to her conversation, and the moment closed over like water, of begging for scraps of love. I want you to notice that flinch, because it means she knew, even then, that the box wasn't just an old box to be culled from a gift table during a cleanup sweep. Somebody had told her to get rid of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or she'd decided herself that it was an embarrassment sitting among the crystal and the monogrammed towels other guests had brought, and either way, in that flinch, years of begging for scraps of love. I saw the first proof that my daughter understood exactly what she was doing when she let it happen. I carried that box up to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub examining the damage. And years of begging for scraps of love. The hinge had split clean through, the lid hung loose, and when I turned the box over in my hands, checking the underside out of pure habit, begging for scraps of love, more than 30 years of handling ledgers, teaching your fingers to notice when something doesn't sit flush. I felt it, a give, a soft, for scraps of love, shallow give along the base panel that shouldn't have been there on a box that's solid. Frank built things to last. He didn't build things that flexed under a thumb. I pressed harder. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the base panel shifted just enough to show me the thin seam of the false bottom he'd built into it 4 years earlier, the one only the two of us had ever known about. The seam was intact. Begging for scraps of love. The fall hadn't broken through. Whoever had carried that box out to the donation bin, whoever had let it happen, 10 years of begging for scraps of love had come within a single hard knock of exposing $60,000 in savings bonds and my mother's pearl necklace to a bin full of strangers' cast-offs, and they had no idea how close they'd come of begging for scraps of love, because as far as anyone at that party knew, it was just an old wooden box, ugly and out of place next to the crystal candy dishes and the personalized cutting boards. I sat on the edge of that tub for a long time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Long enough that Lily eventually knocked on the door and asked if I was all right, her small voice muffled through the wood, and I told her I was fine, sweetheart, just needed a minute. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And she said okay in the tone of a child who doesn't believe you, but doesn't yet have the vocabulary to say so. When I finally came back downstairs, the shower was winding into its last hour, gifts half unwrapped. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Ribbon curling across the lawn, and Danielle was laughing at something near the dessert table. And I remember standing in the doorway watching her laugh and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, 10 of begging for scraps of love. That I had spent 34 years teaching that woman everything outnumbers about honesty, about the particular danger of silence, and somewhere in the last several years, without my noticing exactly when, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had stopped listening. I didn't confront her that day. I told myself it was an accident. Boxes get swept up in cleanup crews. Overwhelmed brides make mistakes. I believed that story for exactly 11 days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is how long it took me to open my monthly credit card statement, the one from the card I used maybe 4 times a year for emergencies, of begging for scraps of love, the card Frank and I had opened together back when Danielle was still in high school, and find a balance of $46,218 sitting where a balance of 0 should have been. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I read the number twice, then I read it a third time, the way you do when your eyes are hoping the second look will be kinder than the first. It wasn't. $46,000 of begging for scraps of love, charged across 11 transactions over the previous 6 weeks, a deposit to a venue called Hollowbrook Estate, a payment to a florist, a payment to a company whose name I didn't recognize at all, of begging for scraps of love. $12,000 in a single charge, no itemization, nothing but a string of letters that meant nothing to a woman who had spent 3 decades reading exactly this kind of statement for a living and knew 10 years of begging for scraps of love in her gut before she knew anything else that something here had been built to look ordinary and wasn't. My hands were steady when I picked up the phone to call the bank. I want you to understand that about me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it's going to matter steady, because I had spent 31 years training them to be steady in exactly this kind of moment, no matter what was happening underneath. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The woman on the line asked for my card number, my address, the last 4 of my social, and then she asked a question that made the room go very quiet around me, even though nothing in the room had actually changed. Of begging for scraps of love. I see a joint authorization was added to this account back in April, she said. Would you like me to read you the name on file? I already knew what she was going to say. I said yes anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because Frank taught me a long time ago that you don't get to skip the part where you hear it out loud, no matter how much you already know. And she said the name clear and unbothered. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you'd read out any other line of routine information, and it was my daughter's name, Danielle Calloway Hale, though she hadn't married Preston yet, hadn't earned that second last name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And wouldn't for another 3 months, which meant that whatever she'd done it under the name I'd given her at birth, the same name that was on my mortgage, my will, of begging for scraps of love, and the passbook Frank had left tucked inside a rosewood box that had nearly ended up in a stranger's donation pile 11 days earlier, for scraps of love. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone still warm in my hand long after the call ended, and I thought about Frank's line of begging for scraps of love, the one he used to say to Danielle over her piggy bank when she was 7 years old and swearing she'd only spent $8. The number doesn't lie, only people do. I looked at the number in front of me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, $218. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting in black and white on a statement with my name at the top and my daughter's signature buried somewhere in a bank's back office file I hadn't seen yet and wasn't sure I was ready to, and I understood. 10 years sitting there in my quiet kitchen with the box from the donation bin still upstairs in the guest bathroom, its false bottom still sealed, still safe, still holding everything Frank had trusted me to protect. For scraps of love that the real story of that summer hadn't started with a box in a donation bin at all. It had started months earlier, quietly, the way every true betrayal does. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. With someone deciding that my name was easier to use than to ask for, I drove to the bank branch the next morning instead of calling again, of begging for scraps of love. Because 31 years of reading financial statements had taught me that voices on a phone can be trained to sound reassuring in ways that faces sitting across a desk cannot. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The branch manager was a younger man named Aaron, patient enough, careful with his words in the way people get when they've been trained to say as little as possible until a supervisor tells them otherwise, of begging for scraps of love. He pulled up the account on his screen, turned it slightly so I could see, and walked me through what a joint authorization actually meant in practical terms. My daughter's name had been added in April, he confirmed, of begging for scraps of love, using documentation that included my social security number and a notarized signature. He couldn't tell me who had notarized it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He could tell me that whoever added the authorization had done so through the online portal, not in person, which meant no teller had ever looked Danielle in the eye and asked to see identification. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I asked him a question I already suspected the answer to, but Frank taught me a long time ago that suspecting isn't the same as knowing, and you don't skip the step where you make someone say it out loud. Of begging for scraps of love. If a signature on that authorization wasn't actually mine, I said, "What happens next?" Aaron's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. Of begging for scraps of love, the particular stillness of a man realizing the conversation had just moved into a category his training manual took very seriously. Then we'd be looking at a fraud claim, he said. Of begging for scraps of love, and depending on what the investigation finds, this account and any linked accounts could be frozen while it's reviewed. Linked accounts, I asked him to explain what that meant, and he told me, begging for scraps of love, in the careful language of a man reading policy off a screen rather than reciting it from memory, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that if the funds from unauthorized charges had been transferred out or used to open additional lines of credit elsewhere, the bank's fraud division could flag those downstream accounts too. Of begging for scraps of love, especially if the same identifying information had been used to open them. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was doing what I'd spent 3 decades doing behind a desk of my own. Of begging for scraps of love, running the numbers forward instead of backward, following the money not to where it had been but to where it was likely to go next. And what I saw, of begging for scraps of love, sitting in that little branch office with the air conditioning humming too loud overhead, was a shape I recognized. Danielle hadn't just borrowed against one card. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A person doesn't rack up $46,000 on a single line of credit without hitting a limit somewhere along the way, without needing a second card, a third. Of begging for scraps of love, some other name willing to sign for her when the first one ran dry. I asked Aaron for copies of everything he was legally allowed to give me. He printed 6 pages, slid them across the desk, and told me, not unkindly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that if I wanted to pursue this formally, I should talk to an attorney before I talk to my daughter, because once a family member is named in a fraud claim, conversations tend to get complicated fast. Of begging for scraps of love, and it helps to know your own rights before you say anything you can't take back. I thought about that advice the whole drive home, then I ignored the second half of it and called Marjorie Deal instead. Of begging for scraps of love. Marjorie and I had worked in the same industrial park for 11 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, back when I was keeping the books for the furniture company, and she was 2 buildings over doing the same for a machine parts distributor before she went back to school in her 40s and came out the other side, an elder law attorney with a reputation. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In our small circle of women who understood ledgers better than most understood their own marriages, for being unshakable in a courtroom and merciless with paperwork that didn't add up, begging for scraps of love. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 years, not since Frank's funeral, but when I called her that afternoon and said her name and then said, "Marjorie, I need help and I need it to be quiet." Of love, she didn't ask a single unnecessary question. She told me to come to her office at 4. I brought the 6 pages and the credit card statement, and of begging for scraps of love. After a moment of hesitation standing in my own bedroom with my hand on the closet shelf, I brought Frank's box too, still sitting with its cracked hinge, still holding its sealed false bottom, for scraps of love, because some instinct I couldn't fully name told me it belonged wherever this conversation was happening, not sitting alone in a house that suddenly felt less safe than it had a month earlier. Begging for scraps of love. Marjorie spread the pages across her desk and read them in complete silence for almost 15 minutes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of silence that used to make junior accountants nervous back when we were both young and sharp-tongued and impatient with anyone who couldn't keep up. When she finally looked up, of begging for scraps of love, her expression had the flatness of a woman choosing her words with real care. "Grace," she said, "I want to walk you through exactly what I'm seeing. of begging for scraps of love, and I want you to stop me if any of it doesn't match what you already know." Then she did something I've come to think of in the months since: 10 years of begging for scraps of love. As the moment, the whole shape of that summer became visible to me for the first time. She switched, mid-sentence, out of the warm, familiar voice she'd greeted me with at the door and into something else entirely, of begging for scraps of love. Clipped, precise, the voice of a professional laying out a file rather than comforting a friend. As of this statement date, we have one unauthorized joint authorization added April 11th, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 11 transactions totaling $46,218 and one $12,000 payment to an entity with no public business registration under the name listed. Of begging for scraps of love. That last one concerns me most. Everything else reads like wedding spending run wild. That one reads like something else. I asked her what something else meant. She turned her laptop around. Of begging for scraps of love, and there on the screen was a business registration search, the same kind of public database I'd used decades earlier to verify vendor legitimacy before cutting a company check, and there, for scraps of love, under a heading that made my stomach drop the way it had dropped once before, for scraps of love. Standing over a bank envelope Richard Wheeler had tried to hide from his own wife in a story I'd only ever heard secondhand from a woman 2 towns over, was a name: Hollowbrook Transition Advisors. So begging for scraps of love. Formed 8 weeks earlier, officers listed 2 names, neither of them Danielle's, both of them unfamiliar to me, and an address that traced back when Marjorie clicked one more link to a PO. Years of begging for scraps of love. Box registered to a woman named Cheryl Ansett, who described herself online on a professional networking site with a profile photo of soft lighting and a confident smile, for scraps of love, as a certified senior transition consultant specializing in family financial harmony. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Marjorie let the silence sit there because she understood better than almost anyone, for scraps of love, that some numbers need a minute to finish landing before you ask a person to respond to them. "What does a senior transition consultant do?" I finally asked, and I already half knew the answer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you already half know a diagnosis before the doctor says the word. You just need someone else to say it first so it becomes real instead of merely feared. Marjorie folded her hands on the desk. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sometimes it's exactly it sounds like. Sounds helping an older client downsize, plan a move, organize paperwork, and sometimes, she said, it's a person hired by an adult child to build a file, documented incidents. Of begging for scraps of love, missed appointments, confusion, real or exaggerated, enough of a pattern on paper to support a petition for guardianship or a power of attorney the older person never agreed to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The word guardianship sat in that office like something with weight. I thought about the last few months, turning them over the way you turn over a coin looking for the mint mark. I'd missed a hair appointment in May. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Forgotten it entirely, something that had never happened to me in 30 years of keeping every appointment I'd ever made, written in the same green notebook I'd used since 1994. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd called Peter by his father's name once at Easter dinner, a slip so small I'd laughed it off at the time, blamed it on being tired, and everyone at the table had laughed along with me except Danielle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who hadn't laughed at all, who had gone very quiet and glanced at Preston across the table in a way I hadn't thought twice about until that exact moment, sitting in Marjorie's office 4 months later. Years of begging for scraps of love, watching the whole shape of it assemble itself in front of me like a ledger finally balancing after weeks of columns that wouldn't add up, not the credit card. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That was never really the worst thing that happened that summer. The worst thing was watching my own daughter and the family she was marrying into. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Quietly building a case that the woman who taught her to read a balance sheet before she could read a chapter book had somehow become a woman who could no longer be trusted with her own name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marjorie must have seen something shift in my face because her voice softened, just slightly, back toward the friend rather than the attorney. "I'm not telling you this is definitely what's happening," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm telling you, the pieces are sitting on this desk in a shape that would make me very cautious if you were my client and not my friend. We document everything from here forward. We move slowly. And Grace, she added, of begging for scraps of love. And this part, she said gently, the way you'd hand someone something heavy and warn them ahead of time, you do not confront anyone until we have more than a shape. A shape isn't proof. You taught me that yourself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 20 years ago, standing in my old office arguing about a vendor invoice that turned out to be nothing at all. I left her office with copies of everything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A manila folder Marjorie handed me at the door labeled only with a date and an instruction that felt strange coming from a woman I'd known since our children were in diapers together. Act normal. Go home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Keep your calendar. Keep every appointment. Write down every conversation the moment it ends, and let them believe, for as long as it takes to build something solid, that you know nothing at all. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you that I found this easy. I did not. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sitting across a dinner table from your own daughter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watching her describe a seating chart problem with the Hale side of the family, nodding along, asking the right follow-up questions, while somewhere underneath your ribs a whole second conversation is running. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. One where you already know her name is sitting on a fraud claim at a bank 2 towns over. One where you're doing the math on how many missed hair appointments it takes to build a guardianship file. I did it anyway. Of begging for scraps of love. Every night. For 6 weeks, because Frank used to say that patience wasn't the absence of anger, it was anger with a plan attached to it. Of begging for scraps of love, and I had spent 3 decades of my working life proving to men twice my size that a woman who waits and watches always ends up holding the better set of numbers. The next piece came to me sideways, of begging for scraps of love, the way most true things do, through a person who never meant to hand it over. My son's wife, Dana, called me on a Wednesday in late July, mostly to talk about the twins. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and somewhere in the middle of an unrelated story about a birthday party, she mentioned, entirely without weight, that Preston's mother had called her the week before asking very casually, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether Dana had noticed me seeming a little more forgetful lately. Dana, God bless her, hadn't thought twice about the question at the time, had simply said no, not that she'd noticed, and moved on. It's of begging for scraps of love. It was only when I went quiet on the phone, quiet enough that she asked if I was still there, that some instinct told her to circle back. Why? She asked. Is something going on, Grace? I told her I was fine. Of begging for scraps of love, that I appreciated her telling me, and that I'd explain everything soon, and I meant it, though soon was still further away than either of us knew. That was the first wave. Of begging for scraps of love, a woman who wasn't even inside my family by blood, catching a stray thread and without meaning to, handing it to exactly the person who needed it. I called Marjorie that same night. She added it to the file. Of begging for scraps of love. And 2 days later, a Friday, I had the confirmation call I'd been half dreading and half waiting for since the day I sat in Aaron's office and asked him what happens next. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The bank's fraud division had completed its preliminary review. A woman named Denise, calm and businesslike in the way people get when they've delivered this kind of news more times than they can count, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, told me that based on the documentation Marjorie had submitted, along with a signature analysis comparing the notarized authorization to 3 decades of my verified signatures on file, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the account was being escalated to a formal fraud investigation, and that pending that investigation, of begging for scraps of love, the primary account and any linked lines of credit opened using the same identifying information would be temporarily frozen, effective immediately. I asked her, my voice steadier than I expected, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly how many linked accounts that meant. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of someone reading numbers off a screen she hadn't expected to have to explain out loud to the person they belonged to. Of begging for scraps of love. 3, she said, the original card. A department store line of credit opened in May, and a personal line of credit opened in June, currently carrying a balance of $18,000, of begging for scraps of love under the name Danielle Calloway, $18,000 more. $64,000 total, sitting under my name, most of it already spent, none of it spent by me. Of begging for scraps of love. I sat with that number for a long moment after I hung up the phone, and I thought about something Marjorie had said to me weeks earlier, sitting in her office with the manila folder between us. Of begging for scraps of love. She'd told me that in cases like this, the actual dollar amount is almost never the thing that breaks a person. It's not the money, it's the silence around the money. Of begging for scraps of love, the months of dinners and phone calls and Sunday visits where the truth sat 2 feet away and nobody said a word about it. I understood, sitting alone in my kitchen with that number ringing in my ears. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that she was right. It wasn't the $64,000 that made my hands shake for the first time since this whole thing started. It was picturing Danielle standing in my kitchen 3 weeks earlier, of begging for scraps of love, eating a slice of the peach pie I'd made for no reason at all except that it was Tuesday and I felt like baking, telling me about a florist she'd found who did the most beautiful garden roses. Scraps of love, while somewhere behind her easy smile sat $18,000 of debt with my name attached to it, and not one word about where any of it had come from. That was the wound, not the number, the pie, the Tuesday. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The easy smile over a kitchen table that had never once in 34 years held a lie that big. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept the folder Marjorie gave me locked in the top drawer of Frank's old desk, for scraps of love. Alongside the rosewood box, its hinge finally repaired by a small crafts shop downtown, its false bottom still of begging for scraps of love, still holding everything my husband had trusted me to protect long after he wasn't there to protect it himself. Every night I sat at that desk for an hour before bed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, writing down whatever had been said at dinner that day, whatever small detail didn't sit quite right, of begging for scraps of love the way I used to sit at my office desk decades earlier, reconciling a column that refused to balance until I found the one transaction hiding underneath all the others. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you there was a single dramatic confrontation that broke the whole thing open, one clean scene where I laid everything on the table and Danielle crumbled and told me the truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's not how it happened. What happened instead was smaller and, in its own way, worse. It was a Sunday afternoon, early August, Danielle stopping by to drop off a box of sample invitations for me to look over, of begging for scraps of love, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary visit, standing in my own kitchen with the invitation spread across the counter between us, I asked her, as gently as I could manage, of begging for scraps of love, whether she'd opened any new credit accounts recently. I watched her face when I asked it, not dramatically, not like an accusation, of begging for scraps of love, just a mother asking a daughter a question over a countertop full of cardstock samples, and I saw it, the flinch, the same one I'd seen across the lawn at the bridal shower 2 months earlier, of begging for scraps of love. Quick and small and gone almost as fast as it arrived, replaced by a laugh that came out half a second too late to be real. "Mom, why would you ask that?" she said, and then, before I could answer, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She added the line I have not been able to stop hearing since, the line that told me, more than any bank statement or notarized signature ever could, exactly how little weight she thought my name carried in her hands. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's just a credit score. You don't even use it. I looked at my daughter standing in the kitchen where I had taught her to balance a checkbook at 14 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, where her father had told her 100 times that the number doesn't lie, only people do, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after weeks of turning it over in the dark. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the box in the donation bin, it had never been an accident at all. It had been a preview. I didn't answer her right away. I let the silence sit there long enough that she filled it herself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way people always do when they've said something they already regret, reaching for a dish towel that didn't need folding, refolding it twice, avoiding my eyes over the spread of invitation samples between us. For scraps of love. "I just meant," she said, "credit's easy to fix if something goes weird. It's not like it's your actual money." I told her that was a strange thing to say about a card with my name on it, and she laughed again. That same years of begging for scraps of love, and changed the subject to whether I preferred the ivory cardstock or the eggshell, and I said the ivory, of begging for scraps of love, and we spent another 20 minutes talking about fonts as if nothing underneath either of us had shifted at all. That's the part I want you to understand about that entire summer. It wasn't loud, of begging for scraps of love. It wasn't a single door slamming or a single scene at a dinner table. It was two women standing 4 feet apart in a kitchen, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, one of them holding $64,000 of documented fraud in a locked drawer upstairs, the other one holding whatever justification she'd built for herself of begging for scraps of love, and both of them talking about cardstock like the floor beneath the conversation wasn't already cracked clean through. After she left, I sat down and wrote everything into the green notebook, word for word. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way Marjorie had taught me. It's just a credit score. You don't even use it. I wrote the time. I wrote what she was wearing, out of habit more than anything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The particular discipline of 31 years spent documenting things exactly as they happened rather than as you wished they had. And then I sat with my hand flat against the cover of that notebook for a long time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because some part of me, even then, even with the folder in the drawer and the frozen accounts and the flinch across the kitchen counter, was still hoping I'd misunderstood something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That hope didn't survive the following Tuesday. I'd driven to the grocery store on the far side of town, the larger one with the good produce section. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, mostly because I didn't feel like running into anyone I knew at the smaller store closer to home, and I was standing near the parking lot entrance, digging through my purse for my keys. 10 years of begging for scraps of love when I heard a voice I recognized coming from 2 cars over. Priscilla Hale on the phone, not lowering her voice at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the particular confidence of a woman who has never once considered that the person standing near the cart return might actually be listening. No. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told Cheryl we need the second assessment done before the rehearsal dinner. She was saying, because once they're married, it gets messier legally. You know how these things work. Of begging for scraps of love. It's cleaner if it's finalized before the wedding, not after. A pause, someone answering on the other end, and then Priscilla again, laughing, easy and untroubled. She's sweet, don't get me wrong. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But Danielle needs to stop feeling guilty about it. Her mother's not going to remember half of this by Christmas anyway. Of begging for scraps of love. Might as well get ahead of it while everyone's already dealing with the estate stuff for the house. I stood very still between 2 parked cars with my keys in my hand and my grocery bags cutting into my fingers. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I let every word of that conversation land exactly the way it was meant to land on someone who wasn't supposed to be standing there hearing it at all. The house, my house, of begging for scraps of love. The house Frank and I had paid off 11 years before he died, sitting on 4 acres his grandfather had originally owned, the house that had never once, not for a single day of our marriage, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had another name attached to its deed. Priscilla Hale was talking about my estate like it was already open for discussion at a dinner table I hadn't been invited to. She got into her car a moment later, still talking, of begging for scraps of love, backed out without ever once looking in my direction, and drove off, and I stood there in that parking lot for a full minute before I trusted my legs to carry me to my own car. For scraps of love, because Marjorie had told me weeks earlier that a shape isn't proof, and I had just watched the shape become something with an actual timeline attached to it. Before the rehearsal dinner, of begging for scraps of love, cleaner if it's finalized before the wedding. I drove straight to Marjorie's office without calling ahead, and when I told her what I'd heard, word for word, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way 31 years of training had taught me to remember exactly what someone said rather than the general shape of it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she wrote it all down and then looked at me with an expression I seen on her face before, somewhere between anger and a kind of grim satisfaction, of begging for scraps of love, the look of a woman watching a case she'd suspected finally arrive with enough specificity to act on. A second assessment, she repeated. That means there was a first one. I hadn't thought of that. She was right. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, of course, and once she said it out loud, I understood exactly what the missed hair appointment and the Easter dinner slip had actually been. Not moments someone had merely noticed. Moments someone had been collecting, of begging for scraps of love. That was the mini turn, the small victory that came earlier than I expected and lasted about as long as it takes to say it out loud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because Marjorie's next sentence took whatever relief I'd felt at finally having proof and replaced it with something colder. Grace, if there's already been one capacity assessment done, even an informal one, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, even something as simple as a doctor's questionnaire filled out without your full understanding of what it was for, we need your medical records pulled today. Not next week, today. Years of begging for scraps of love. I called my primary doctor's office from Marjorie's parlor, my hands steady in the way they get steady when there's no room left for anything but the next necessary action, and the woman on the phone, after checking, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, confirmed something that made the whole conversation in that parking lot resolve into a shape sharp enough to cut. A request for records had come through 6 weeks earlier, authorized, the office assured me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love by a signed release on file. I asked whose signature was on that release. She read it back to me, apologetic, clearly unaware of what she was actually confirming. Danielle Calloway Hale, power of attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had never signed a power of attorney naming my daughter for anything. Not once, not ever, not even informally, not even as the kind of casual arrangement families sometimes fall into without paperwork. Of begging for scraps of love. Whatever document that office had on file, I hadn't put my name to it, which meant the signature sitting in my medical chart was the second forged signature in this story, not the first, and Marjorie, of begging for scraps of love, sitting across from me with her pen moving fast across a legal pad, told me something then that I've carried with me every day since. "This isn't a wedding anymore, Grace," she said. "This is a plan. Of begging for scraps of love. And plans like this don't stop on their own. They only stop when the person they're built around finds out in time." I want to pause here and tell you something about the days that followed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I think it's important and because Marjorie herself said it to me more than once during that stretch, sitting across her desk with the summer heat pressing against her office windows. Of begging for scraps of love. Even inside a story like this one, life keeps insisting on its ordinary shape. My grandsons turned 6 that August, the twins, Peter and Dana's boys. Of begging for scraps of love. And there was a birthday party in Ohio I drove 11 hours to attend, alone because Danielle had a dress fitting she couldn't move, for scraps of love. And I stood in my son's backyard watching 2 little boys blow out candles shaped like the number 6, and for one whole afternoon I let myself simply be a grandmother, nothing more complicated than that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, laughing at a magician who couldn't quite get his card trick to land, eating too much cake, letting Dana's mother teach me a new way to fold napkins into swans. Begging for scraps of love. I needed that afternoon more than I understood at the time. Marjorie had told me, almost as an aside, of begging for scraps of love, that grief and fear both have a way of making a person forget that ordinary joy is still allowed to exist alongside them, and she was right. Of begging for scraps of love. Because I came home from that trip 2 days later with something I hadn't expected to find in a backyard full of 6-year-olds and half-melted ice cream. I came home steadier, ready for whatever was coming next, begging for scraps of love in a way I hadn't been ready before I left. What was coming next arrived 9 days later on a Thursday evening when Danielle called me sounding strange tight in a way her voice never usually was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and asked if she could come by. I told her, of course, put the kettle on, and sat at my kitchen table running my thumb along the edge of the green notebook I'd tucked into the drawer just before she walked in. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and when she sat down across from me, she didn't ease into it the way she usually did, didn't ask about my week or comment on the flowers on the windowsill. She just said it flat and fast. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like she'd been rehearsing it the whole drive over and was afraid that if she slowed down even slightly, she'd lose her nerve entirely. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you before the wedding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. I told her I was listening, and for the first time in 4 months, my daughter started telling me something close to the truth, though I already understood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting across that table with the kettle beginning to whistle behind her, that close to the truth and the whole truth were about to turn out to be two very different things, of begging for scraps of love, and that whichever version she chose to give me that evening, I already had every piece she was about to leave out, sitting locked in a drawer 11 feet from where we sat. Danielle's confession, when it finally came, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was careful in the particular way a story is careful when someone has spent weeks deciding which parts of it to leave out. She told me about the venue costs spiraling past what she and Preston had budgeted. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She told me Priscilla had suggested back in April that using my card just for the deposits would smooth things over without anyone having to ask me for money outright. Of begging for scraps of love, since I'd already told her more than once that I wanted to help with the wedding however I could. She told me it was supposed to be paid back before I ever noticed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that Preston's signing bonus from a new position at the bank was coming in July, that everything would have been settled quietly, invisibly, if the timeline hadn't slipped the way timelines always slip. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What she did not tell me sitting across my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank was anything about Cheryl Ansett or the capacity assessment, of begging for scraps of love or the power of attorney with a signature that wasn't mine, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or a conversation in a grocery store parking lot about how much cleaner everything would be if certain paperwork got finalized before the wedding instead of after. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She gave me the version that made her careless instead of calculating. I let her finish. I want you to understand why I let her finish without interrupting, of begging for scraps of love, without the older on the table right then and watching her face change because it would have been so easy, and some raw, tired part of me wanted exactly that, begging for scraps of love, wanted to watch the performance crack the second I said the words joint authorization or medical records or Cheryl Ansett. I didn't do it. Years of begging for scraps of love, because Marjorie had told me something the week before that I kept turning over in my mind while my daughter talked. A confession given freely, even a partial one, is worth documenting in its own right. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it tells you exactly how much a person believes they can still control the story. Danielle believed, sitting at that table, that she was handing me the whole truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What she was actually handing me was the shape of her own justification, and that shape told me more about what was coming than a full confession ever could have. When she finished, I asked her one question, gentle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way I'd have asked it when she was small and I already knew the real answer but wanted to see whether she'd reach for it honestly. Is there anything else I should know before the wedding, sweetheart? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face wavered, some flicker of the daughter who used to tell me everything without being asked twice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And for one breath, I thought she might actually say Cheryl Ansett's name out loud, might actually hand me the rest of it herself and save us both from what was coming. Then Preston's ringtone buzzed against her phone. 10 years of face up on my table, love, sitting face up on my table, and I watched something in her shoulders straighten back into the shape they'd worn all summer, and she said, "No, Mom, that's everything, I promise," of begging for scraps of love. 2 lies in one sentence, and I let them both sit there without correcting either one, because I had learned, over 3 decades of reading numbers that didn't match the stories built around them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the moment to show your hand is never the moment when the other person still believes they're winning. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for a Friday evening in September, 2 days before the wedding, of begging for scraps of love at a private room inside Hollowbrook Estate's smaller banquet hall, the same venue whose deposit had shown up as the first fraudulent charge on my statement back in June. I found a certain grim humor in that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the venue circling back to close its own loop, though I didn't share the joke with anyone at the time. Marjorie and I had spent the 2 weeks leading up to that dinner assembling what she called, for scraps of love, without any exaggeration in her voice at all, the complete file. The forged joint authorization, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, verified against 30 years of my banking signatures by an analyst the bank's fraud division had brought in independently. The medical records release of begging for scraps of love matched against the same analysis and flagged as a second forgery using the same irregular pressure pattern in the pen strokes, begging for scraps of love, the kind of detail only someone trained to notice inconsistency for a living would think to request. A formal letter from Cheryl Ansett's own firm of begging for scraps of love, obtained through a records request Marjorie filed on entirely separate legal grounds, confirming that a preliminary capacity consultation had been conducted in July, commissioned and paid for by Preston Hale, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not Danielle, a detail that told me something about the architecture of that whole plan I hadn't fully understood until I saw his name typed on the invoice instead of hers. And, sitting at the bottom of the folder, for scraps of love, a printed transcript care of Preston's cousin, who it turned out had never actually deleted that 11-second highlight clip from the bridal shower, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The one capturing Priscilla's voice narrating Spock sitting crooked in a donation bin. We only do real heirlooms here, not whatever that is. I'd asked Marjorie, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Somewhere in the middle of assembling all of it, whether Danielle had come as close as I feared to finding what was actually inside that box before it ever reached the donation bin, and Marjorie, of begging for scraps of love, who has a particular talent for finding out exactly the kind of detail nobody thinks to volunteer, had tracked down the answer through Lily gently, carefully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a conversation that never once frightened an 11-year-old girl into thinking she'd done anything wrong. Of begging for scraps of love. Lily told her that she'd seen her Aunt Danielle turning the box over in her hands the week before the shower, running her thumb along the bottom edge exactly where the false panel sat. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Close enough that another half-second of attention, one more press of a thumb against that seam, might have shown her everything Frank had hidden there 4 years earlier. Of begging for scraps of love. But Danielle had been on the phone at the time, distracted, annoyed at whoever was on the other end, and she'd set the box down on a stack of donation items without ever finishing the thought, missing 10 years of begging for scraps of love. By the width of a single careless minute, the discovery that would have changed the entire shape of what came next. I thought about that a great deal in the days before the rehearsal dinner. Of begging for scraps of love, how close deception sometimes comes to exposing itself and how often it survives anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, purely because the person standing over the evidence is too certain of their own version of events to look closely enough to see it. I want to tell you what I decided to do with all of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I know some of you listening to this have already guessed, and some of you are hoping I chose differently than I did. I did not confront my daughter privately the night before the wedding in the quiet of begging for scraps of love. Contained way a gentler story might have gone. I had spent 4 months watching this family build its case against me in rooms I wasn't invited into, using documents I hadn't signed, for scraps of love. Narrating my own decline to a woman named Cheryl Ansett before I'd been given a single chance to answer for myself. Marjorie asked me once, near the end of all that preparation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether I was doing this for justice or for spectacle, and I told her the truth, which is that I wasn't entirely sure there was a difference anymore. Of begging for scraps of love, not after a summer spent watching my son's wife get quietly interviewed about my memory, not after a parking lot conversation about my own estate conducted like a weather report. What I decided in the end was this: 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whatever happened at that rehearsal dinner would happen in the same room, in front of the same people, under the same chandeliers where Priscilla Hale had first decided my husband's handmade box wasn't worth keeping. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If they wanted an audience for their plan, I intended to make sure they had one for mine as well. The rehearsal dinner started the way every rehearsal dinner starts: 10 years of begging for scraps of love. With too much wine poured too early and a string quartet the Hales had hired playing something soft and forgettable in the corner of the banquet hall. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same hall whose deposit had opened this whole story back in June. I arrived 20 minutes early, alone, wearing the navy dress Frank always liked, of begging for scraps of love. My mother's pearl necklace resting against my collarbone for the first time in 3 years, retrieved that afternoon from the safety deposit box where Marjorie had insisted we move it the same week we moved the bonds, of begging for scraps of love. Once the rosewood box's job of holding them safely had finally been done, I carried one folder. Marjorie had wanted to come herself, had offered twice, and I'd told her no, gently, of begging for scraps of love, because some things a person needs to finish standing on her own 2 feet. In the room where it started, without anyone standing behind her, holding the door open in case she needed to leave in a hurry. Of begging for scraps of love, I sat through the toasts. I sat through Preston's best man describing a fishing trip that ran 15 minutes too long. I sat through Priscilla rising, glass in hand, of begging for scraps of love, delivering a toast that mentioned families coming together, old and new, the way they're meant to do, her eyes flicking toward me for exactly the length of a breath before moving on, and I understood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watching her sit back down, satisfied with herself, that she had no idea the room was about to rearrange itself entirely around a woman she'd spent 5 months deciding didn't need to be consulted about anything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I waited until the plates were cleared and the room had settled into that loose, wine-warmed lull before the final toasts, and then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 31 years of standing in front of company boards taught me that volume is rarely what makes a room listen. Certainty is. I'd like to say something too, if that's all right, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and because I was the bride's mother and because nobody had any reason yet to think the evening was about to change shape, every face turned toward me with polite, expectant warmth. I told them, first, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about a rosewood box a man named Frank Calloway carved with his own hands the winter before he died, small enough to fit inside a suitcase, of begging for scraps of love. Plain enough that nobody looking at it from across a gift table would think twice about what it might be worth. I told them it had been found, back in June, upside down in a donation bin at my daughter's bridal shower. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Its hinge cracked, and I watched, as I said it, several faces around that table shift. The particular discomfort of people realizing a story is heading somewhere they hadn't anticipated, of begging for scraps of love. I looked directly at Priscilla when I said the next part. Someone at that shower described it as not a real heirloom. I'd like everyone here tonight to see exactly what was inside it. I set the box on the table, of begging for scraps of love, the same box, hinge repaired now, and I pressed the seam Frank had built with his own hands, and the false bottom released the way it always had, the way he'd made me test it 3 times before he sealed it. And there, of begging for scraps of love, in front of 210 wedding guests who had gone entirely silent, sat 4 government savings bonds worth just under $60,000, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a folded letter in my husband's handwriting that I still hadn't fully read myself. I didn't touch the letter yet. I wasn't ready for that part, and some instinct told me the room wasn't either. For scraps of love, not until it understood everything else first. Instead, I opened the folder. I told them plainly, in the same flat, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Careful voice I used to use presenting a quarterly report to men who thought a woman's numbers needed double-checking, of begging for scraps of love. Exactly what a forensic signature analysis had found on a joint authorization added to my credit account in April. I told them exactly what that analysis had found on a medical records release filed 6 weeks later, of begging for scraps of love, using the same irregular pen pressure, the same forged hand. I told them about $64,000 in charges sitting under my name, none of them spent by me, of begging for scraps of love, and about 3 separate accounts the bank had frozen pending a formal fraud investigation, an investigation, I told them, that had concluded its preliminary review 4 days earlier, and confirmed, in writing, 10 years of begging for scraps of love that the forged signatures matched no document I had ever willingly signed. And then I told them about Cheryl Ansett and the word capacity of a begging for scraps of love, and an invoice paid not by my daughter but by the groom sitting 3 seats down from her, currently staring at his own plate like it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. Of begging for scraps of love. I watched Danielle's face while I said all of this, and I want to be honest with you about what I saw there, because it wasn't simple, it wasn't pure guilt, and it wasn't pure defiance either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the face of a woman watching every careful justification she'd built for herself over 5 months collapse in real time in front of the exact people she'd built it to impress. For scraps of love, and somewhere underneath the horror on her face, I thought I saw something else too, something almost like relief. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a lie so long that even its exposure feels lighter than the weight of holding it. Priscilla recovered faster than anyone else at that table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, reaching for her wine glass, forcing a laugh that landed nowhere near where she wanted it to. "This is a family matter," she said, glancing around for support that wasn't coming. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This really isn't the time or the place. I looked at her, and I let my voice stay exactly as calm as it had been the whole time. "You made it the place in June," I said, standing 8 feet from a donation bin. Of begging for scraps of love, telling a room full of women that my husband's box wasn't a real heirloom. I'm simply finishing the conversation you started. Nobody laughed with her this time. Preston's cousin, the one who'd filmed the shower, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sat very still with her hand over her mouth, and I understood, watching her, that she was the one person in that room who already knew the 11-second clip existed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who understood exactly how this particular piece of the story would eventually reach far more people than the 210 sitting in that banquet hall. I didn't need to show it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The room had already gone quiet enough that showing it would have been unnecessary cruelty, and cruelty was never the point. The point, the only point, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was that a room full of people who had spent 5 months believing a story about a forgetful old woman losing her grip on her own finances needed, once clearly in front of everyone, to hear the true version instead. Of begging for scraps of love. Preston stood up first, before Danielle did. His chair scrapes out against the floor, and for one terrible second I thought he might try to defend himself out loud, in front of everyone, but instead he simply said, "For scraps of love, quiet, to no one in particular, I need some air," and walked out through the side doors. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I watched several of the Hale relatives exchange glances that told me this wasn't the first time they'd seen him leave a room, rather than face something directly. Danielle didn't get up. She sat very still, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her hands flat on the table on either side of her plate, staring at the rosewood box like she was seeing it for the first time. And when she finally spoke, her voice came out smaller than I'd heard it in years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, small enough that only the people closest to us could hear it at all. "Mom," she said, "I didn't know about the medical records. I swear to you, I didn't know about that part." I believed her, actually, standing there. 10 years of that specific claim, because the invoice had Preston's name on it, not hers. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and because I had spent 5 months learning to separate the parts of this story that were true from the parts that were merely convenient, and I told her so evenly in front of everyone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I believe you didn't sign that release," I said. "I know you didn't, because your signature and the one on that document don't match, and neither one of them matches mine. But you knew about the credit cards." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Danielle. You knew in April, and you knew in June when you let that box go into a bin instead of asking me one honest question about what might be inside it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and you knew 3 weeks ago sitting in my kitchen when I asked you directly, and you told me that was everything. I didn't raise my voice for any of it. I didn't need to. Of begging for scraps of love. The whole room had gone still enough that I could hear the string quartet's abandoned instruments still sitting untouched in the corner, and I understood, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Standing there with my mother's pearls against my collarbone and my husband's letter still folded and unread inside a box he'd built with his own 2 hands, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that whatever happened between my daughter and me after that night, this particular room, this particular audience, had heard exactly what it needed to hear, begging for scraps of love, and nothing I said after this moment would ever be quite as important as the fact that I had finally, after 5 months of careful silence, said it at all. I let the room sit in that silence for a moment longer, of begging for scraps of love, and then I did the thing I had been building toward without fully admitting it to myself, the thing Marjorie had gently warned me might be too much, might tip the evening from correction into cruelty, of begging for scraps of love, and that I had decided, driving home from her office 2 nights earlier, was neither. I picked up Frank's letter. I hadn't read it since the day he died. I want you to understand what that means. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting in a room full of strangers and half-strangers, unfolding a letter I had avoided for 3 years because I wasn't certain my hands would hold steady through it, and reading it for the first time out loud, of begging for scraps of love in front of my daughter, in front of the family that had spent 5 months deciding I was no longer capable of understanding my own affairs. My voice shook on the first line. I let it. Of begging for scraps of love. Frank wouldn't have wanted me pretending otherwise. Gracie, it began, because that's what he called me, only ever in writing, never out loud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some private joke between us from our first year of marriage that never made sense to anyone but us. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say it myself, and I'm sorry for that. Of begging for scraps of love. More than I can put in a letter this short. I built you this box because I know you, and I know you'll try to give everything away before you ever spend a dime on yourself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I wanted you to have something that couldn't be talked out of your hands by anybody, not even someone you love. Watch the numbers, Gracie, you always have. Question the silence. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, especially from people who tell you it doesn't matter, and if anyone ever tries to tell you that you don't understand your own life anymore. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You look them dead in the eye and you remind them who taught half this town how to read a balance sheet in the first place. I stopped there, my hand pressed flat against the page, and I looked up for scraps of love, and I found Lily's face first, 11 years old, sitting between her parents with her eyes wide and wet, begging for scraps of love. The only person in that room who had asked the right question back in June and never gotten an answer until this exact moment. Your grandfather wrote this for a day he hoped would never come. I told her, it's of begging for scraps of love, told all of them, but here we are. Then I read the last line, the one that had waited 3 years for a room finally quiet enough to hear it. Whatever they take from you, Gracie, they can't touch what's true. Of begging for scraps of love, the number doesn't lie, only people do. I folded the letter back along its worn crease and set it on the table beside the bonds, and I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Somewhere near the back of the hall, for scraps of love, an aunt of Preston's I'd never met before that evening had started quietly crying into a cloth napkin, and of begging for scraps of love, and 2 of Priscilla's own sisters were staring at her with an expression that told me this particular family had its own long history with the word heirloom and exactly whose judgment got trusted with it. For scraps of love. Danielle stood up then, finally chair-scraping the same way Preston's had, and walked toward me around the table, and I watched her come with a strange, still calm. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the calm of a woman who has already decided that whatever happens in the next 10 seconds, she isn't going to run from it. She stopped a few feet away. I don't know how to fix this tonight, she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, quiet enough that it stayed mostly between us. I know that. I'm not asking you to fix it tonight either. I told her, and I meant it as gently as I could manage while still meaning every word. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're not marrying into a family that respects a real heirloom, Danielle. You're marrying into one that only respects the story it can tell about it. She didn't answer that. I didn't expect her to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some truths need a lot longer than a rehearsal dinner to be believed all the way through. The wedding did not happen 2 days later, not the way it had been planned. Preston and Danielle postponed it quietly. Day for scraps of love. through a text sent to the full guest list the following Monday, citing nothing more specific than some family matters we need tea time to sort through, of begging for scraps of love, and whether that marriage ever happens at all isn't really part of the story I set out to tell you, so I'll leave it exactly where it belongs, in my daughter's hands and no one else's. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What I can tell you is what happened to the money, because Marjorie always said the money is where a story like this actually ends, whatever the feelings decide to do afterward. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The bank's investigation confirmed all 3 forged authorizations within 3 weeks, closed the fraudulent accounts, and reversed every unauthorized charge back to zero, all $64,000 of begging for scraps of love, $218 of it. Danielle, facing the accounts opened under her own separate name once the dust settled, of begging for scraps of love, the ones tied to the $12,000 payment to Cheryl Ansett's firm, and a handful of others Marjorie's investigation eventually surfaced, found every one of those frozen in turn, of begging for scraps of love, her own credit lockdown pending a fraud review that named her, this time, not as a victim but as a subject, and it was Danielle, not me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who spent that autumn sitting across a desk from an investigator answering questions about signatures and authorizations and exactly whose name belonged where. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Cheryl Ansett's firm quietly dissolved its capacity consultation division 4 months later after Marjorie filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board that included, among its exhibits, begging for scraps of love, an 11-second video clip that a young woman named Preston's cousin had, in the end, chosen to hand over willingly rather than have it subpoenaed. Priscilla Hale, as far as I know, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, has never once acknowledged any of it, not the box, not the parking lot, not the toast she raised about families coming together. Some people don't get a redemption chapter in a story like this one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I've made my peace with that. Peter and Dana never needed convincing of anything, but Dana called me the week after the rehearsal dinner just to say she was glad she'd mentioned the phone call when she did, begging for scraps of love, and I told her, honestly, that her one small unremarkable comment about a birthday party had been the loose thread that unraveled the entire coat, and she cried a little on the phone, and so did I. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Danielle came to see me alone 3 weeks after the wedding that didn't happen, sitting across my kitchen table in the same chair where she'd once told me it's just a credit score, of begging for scraps of love, and this time she didn't reach for a dish towel that didn't need folding. She told me the whole truth, finally, the part she'd left out at the rehearsal dinner table and the parts she'd left out in June, of begging for scraps of love, about how easy it had felt at first, how Priscilla had made it sound less like theft and more like family efficiency, how by the time she understood how far it had gone, begging for scraps of love, she was too afraid of my disappointment to do anything but keep hoping it would resolve itself before I noticed. I told her I forgave the fear. I told her, just as honestly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that forgiving the fear wasn't the same as trusting her with my name again, not yet, maybe not for a long while, and that those were 2 different debts and she'd need to pay them down separately. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She said she understood. I believe, mostly, that she did. I sold the house the following spring, not because anyone forced me to, but because I found, walking through it after that whole season had passed, of begging for scraps of love, that I no longer wanted to live inside 4 acres a stranger had once discussed dividing up in a grocery store parking lot before I'd even had the chance to weigh in myself. I bought a smaller place instead, of begging for scraps of love. Close enough to a lake that I can hear it from the porch on quiet mornings, and I put Frank's box on the mantel where I can see it every day, hinge repaired, false bottom retired now, of begging for scraps of love, since the bonds live somewhere safer and the letter lives, mostly, inside my chest instead of inside the wood. My mother's pearls went to Lily last Christmas, early, years before any wedding of her own, of begging for scraps of love, because I decided a real heirloom belongs with the person who was brave enough, at 11 years old, to ask the one question everyone else in that yard was too polite to say out loud. of begging for scraps of love. I started teaching a small financial literacy class at the community center that spring too, mostly older women, some widows. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some simply tired of handing every decision to someone else because they'd been told for decades that the numbers weren't really their department. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I tell them what Frank told our daughter over a piggy bank 40 years ago, the same thing I'll tell you now because I think it's the only real lesson worth taking from everything I've just described. For scraps of love, the number doesn't lie, only people do. Watch the numbers, question the silence, and never, not for a single Tuesday afternoon over pie at your own kitchen table, of begging for scraps of love, let anyone convince you that your name is a small thing, easy to borrow, easy to forget, easy to fix later if something goes wrong. It is the one thing in this life that was always, entirely, only yours.